Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Right on Crime podcast. If you're new to the show, welcome. Right on Crime is a national campaign of the Texas Public Policy Foundation that supports conservative criminal justice policy solutions that result in less crime, fewer victims, and safer communities. I'm your host today, Britt Allen, and I'm very excited to be joined by our very own Arkansas State Director, Wil Cheatham. Hi, Wil.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be back on the show.
I know. Welcome back. I've been dying to have you back. I feel like we have a lot to chat about. I have finally gotten to visit Arkansas since we last talked on the podcast. And
That's right.
You're not kidding about all of the trees and the nature you guys have out there. You guys win officially.
It's the natural state. Yep.
Is that what it is? The natural state?
That is. Yep. That's Arkansas's natural state. Yep.
Okay. So you learn something new every day on the Right on Crime podcast. Well, thank you very much for joining us again. I'm really excited to chat with you today because in your first year with Right on Crime, you have had the chance to visit multiple reentry tours and facilities and see different programs firsthand. So I figured you could just start us off with letting us know a little bit about what you did and what you saw.
Sure. So, yes, I have had the opportunity to tour multiple reentry facilities around the central Arkansas area this year. I've gone up as far as White County, which is an hour or so north of here, and I've stayed in town, or I've been just a little bit west of here. So I've been all over, and it's been fascinating to see all these different reentry facilities because one, I never knew that these existed, and I think a lot of people don't, and so going to see all of these places has been really, really interesting to me to see how different approaches, how everyone is taking different approaches to reentry, all with the same goal, however. So, I've toured several of these facilities, and some have been private, some have been faith-based. And I guess I'll talk a little bit about some of the differences in programming that they do, or maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I've enjoyed seeing these facilities to see all the differences in programming because everybody, like I said earlier, everybody has a different idea of how to go about it, but everybody's got the same end goal. So it's been nice to see, like, for example, I've been to one facility, the one up in White County. They are very intense on faith-based initiatives to reentry, instilling a lot of different, faith-based guiding principles to being successful in reentry. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the private ones that I've been to, they are very, very focused on, practical skills, not that the faith-based ones aren't, but very, very, very focused on making sure that you have a job whenever you're getting out, and making sure that your reentry is focused on work, because when you're working, you don't have time to think about anything else. So that has been a huge emphasis in a lot of these private ones I've seen. And then I've also toured a reentry facility that's in jail. I toured the reentry program in the Pulaski County Detention Center just last month. And that was fascinating because they do kind of a combination of the private reentry and the faith-based initiatives, which was great because it was great. It was fascinating to see sort of a holistic approach to these reentry facilities.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's pretty amazing, like you said, how many different facilities and, programs there are that, maybe do things a little bit differently, but ultimately wind up with the same goal, the same end. So I'd love to know, as you were on these tours and you're learning, tell me a little bit about what you saw are the biggest challenges facing people who are coming out of prison in Arkansas.
The biggest challenges I've seen so far in all these facilities are it probably centers around lingering fines and fees are probably a big issue, because that can cause problems getting driver's licenses, getting different, creating administrative barriers that might sort of snowball, that kind of become an issue. So that's been probably the biggest thing. But also just the need for making sure folks get a job and are squared away whenever they get out, because you can't really have a successful reentry without a job. That's pretty much the biggest part of it. So I think the abilities to find a job is probably one of the biggest barriers, in addition to the lingering fines and fees.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we'll talk more about that. But I'd love to back up a little bit too and ask for someone who might not know, can you explain what a reentry program actually looks like day to day for someone preparing to leave prison?
Sure. So in the ones that I've seen, they're very structured. It has there's a lot of classes involved, classes on how to get insurance, how to maintain, how to get a driver's license, how to get a social security card, how to just do a lot of day to day things that they might not have ever done
Right.
or just are unfamiliar with entirely. So going through those, making sure that in one facility that I've toured, they get you a job while you're there. So it's very structured. So you're being taken to work every day. You're coming back. You're making a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
You're being taught how to manage that. You're being taught what you need to do, what you don't need to do, what's important and what's not important. And it's really you're just being, especially in the private ones I've seen, you're being drilled. It's being drilled into you quickly and early on how important structure is and how important it is to maintain certain routines and stay working and keeping your mind occupied, because that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I mean, I know even for me, I could take a class on insurance. I mean, I think we could
Yeah.
all use a reminder of those day-to-day things. You don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So a couple of the facilities that you've toured were Hidden Creek and Renewal Ranch,
Yep.
which you've written blogs about, and they were great.
Yep.
And if anybody's listening and you haven't read them yet, please go to the Right on Crime website. But could you explain how reentry programs like theirs kind of differ from traditional prison environments and maybe why that matters?
Sure. So it's the biggest difference is a certain level of, I would say, a certain level of less focus on the, I guess, a less focus on the correction aspect, so to speak. Although it's still the same thing, it's still corrections, so to speak, but less focus on that in the traditional sense and more focus on, you're here, let's get you out of here and let's make sure you don't come back.
Right.
So it's less about the. I suppose it's more about the making sure that you don't come back, which is the biggest difference that I felt. Was
Right.
the emphasis on that, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a ton of sense. I mean, the crux of all of this is recidivism, right? And so it
Yeah.
actually pivots great to my next question, which is why is it that so many individuals return to prison after serving time? What drives the cycle? And how does reentry act to stop that cycle?
Well, I think the biggest thing is the emphasis on working. And when you're getting out, you don't have a job and you don't have anything to do, well, that's just not a good combination to staying out. So I think these reentry facilities really focus on working and keeping your mind occupied, and they put a lot of emphasis on the family and other things, because whenever you have all of that, you don't have time to do anything else. And so that's the biggest key is work, and making sure that you can have any whether it be trade jobs, any kind of job, just keeping yourself busy is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I know our jobs keep us out of trouble. We stay busy.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
then in that case, from your perspective, what would you say the consequences are of simply building more prisons, adding more beds, but not taking the time to address this reentry component?
So I think I think we could, with the reentry, you can really churn a lot of you can really get a lot of folks in and out in a successful manner and alleviate a lot of this overcrowding. And I think that the more emphasis that you put on that, you probably would end up saving quite a bit of money in the long run as well, because the quicker you're churning these people out and getting them back into society and not seeing them back, the quicker you're seeing a return on that investment.
Right. Not seeing them back being the key. crux of
Well,
all of this.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And a few of the things that you've mentioned in your blog posts as you've been going through all of these tours is like early intervention, early
Sure.
preparation. So
Mhm.
why, in your words, would you say that starting reentry prep early and even during incarceration, not even necessarily fresh out, how does that improve outcomes? What's the difference between starting early versus not?
Well, the starting early is you're aware from the beginning of what the end goal is,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no time to linger. There's no time to dwell on things. The the plan is put in place immediately, and that's why the early intervention is key to make sure that you know what the end goal is.
Yeah, 100%. Makes you a lot
Hmm.
more successful in the long run.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
like you said, you visited state-run facilities, you visited faith-based and private. So,
Yeah.
how do faith-based, private, or community-style reentry programs complement the state's existing program? Like, how do they work hand in hand?
Well, I think it's just they definitely provide a supplement to the instruction that the state is providing. The state does do they do provide a lot of that in the
Mhm.
Arkansas Department of Corrections, and I think that these reentry facilities just provide probably a more intense supplement, or sometimes they might need even more attention per person. You get the reentry services in the Department of Corrections. Maybe you need a little bit more when you get to these facilities where it's more tailored, more personal, and more it's there's more of a focus on individualization and making sure that everybody's plan is what they need to be doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting every time we have conversations about reentry, I feel like there's this elephant in the room of, is reentry really a conservative, thing? Like, is it a conservative line of thinking? I feel like there's a lot of people that might look at reentry facilities or programming and feel like that's very soft on crime, or that, we're being soft on a criminal. But we know that that's not true. We know that that's not
Yeah.
what the data says. So could you explain for maybe somebody that feels that way or isn't familiar why reentry is, a conservative value?
Sure. So, as a conservative, I don't like to spend money. I don't like to spend a lot of money. And so I look at it as a return on, I'm looking at my tax dollars and wanting to see a return on the investment of those tax dollars. So, the less money I can spend housing folks in the Arkansas Department of Corrections, the better, because I don't want to spend that money. So why these facilities are conservative is because it costs far less to run them. And then the idea is the more effective they're run, the less people that are in there, the less people that come back, that I'm seeing a return on that investment on the back end, and I'm not spending as much money.
Right.
So that's the short of it, really.
Yeah. And really that investment, not only less taxpayer dollars, but like ultimately greater public safety in a long run, right? Somebody gets out and they don't reoffend, that means one less victim. And so if we
Sure.
continue that cycle of public safety as the crux, it's the long term of what is going to make our communities safer, and ultimately make our families stronger too.
Yeah.
When parents are in the home and around children, like, there's a way less likelihood that kids are going to end up in the system later on. So it is a long-term investment, but it is a smaller investment, as you said, which is great.
Yeah.
So I'd love to also know then, are there any examples or success stories that come to mind from any of these Arkansas reentry programs that demonstrate how this reduces recidivism in your state?
So I can't point to any specific ones, but I have seen several as I've been to these facilities, just seeing people coming back and staying out and going on to have successful careers, families, that sort of thing. It's not uncommon, but unfortunately I can't point to anything specific. But I have seen these stories at the various facilities, and it's great.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the success stories in these facilities are people that work there, right? Like maybe they've gone through the program or one like
Yeah,
it and then have come back to like pour into other men and women who come after them. So that's also
definitely.
a success story, I would say, too. I'm sure you've seen that.
I saw a lot of that, especially at the Pulaski County jail. That's almost entirely what it is a cycle in a good way.
That's cool. I love
Yeah,
that. Yeah. Positive cycle.
yeah, yeah.
Well, that's great. And I'd love to ask, like, How do reentry programs balance accountability with giving people a real chance to succeed? Because, I think the big thing also part of conservatism is like, when somebody breaks the law, we still need to hold people accountable. That's
For
still
sure.
very much a part of the component here. So can you tell me a little bit more about how those work together?
Sure, I think that's obviously the most important thing is the accountability, and I think a part of that in the reentry is reinforcing that idea through the structured routines
Mhm.
and work and understanding. That is not you need to. We want you to be successful in society. What you were doing was not being successful. It's not working. And so here's how we're going to make that work. And I think that's how that's balanced is through the programming in these reentry facilities.
For sure, for sure. And then we mentioned earlier the cost of all of this, right? Cost of incarceration versus cost of reentry program. Could you give me a little bit more of an insight into the facts and figures? Like, what does that mean for the taxpayer investing in one versus the other?
Well, I think it's long-term investments versus short-term investments. Long-term with the your more traditional prisons, and the short-term with these reentry facilities.
Hmm.
I think that's probably kind of the biggest difference there is short-term versus long-term. The short-term with these reentry facilities, people aren't staying there as longer. If they're doing what they're supposed to do and they're getting out sooner, so you're not having to pay as long. I look at corrections like a business, like I was talking about earlier. Um, and as a taxpayer, if I'm investing in that business, well, I'd like to see a return on it, and I like to maximize how we can make sure that the folks who need to be there are there. That's fine, but the others that we could be successfully reentering and saving money on. Well, I'd like to see that maximization.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you mentioned a statistic to me recently that it costs $25,000 per
Oh,
inmate.
$25,000 a year for in the Arkansas Department of Corrections. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll just leave that right there. That feels like a little bit of a mic drop moment, but it goes to show what you were talking about is like there is this hefty investment. So it's like how can we make it lower and get a better return in the form of public safety? So
Sure.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. My next question, kind of tackling on to the conservative values of it all, is that personal responsibility and strong families are obviously they're conservative values. But so how does reinvesting in reentry promote those specific ideals? Would you say?
As applied to the family.
Yeah, personal
Yeah.
responsibility and
Well,
strong
well,
families.
sure. And that's the biggest thing. The family is the most important thing,
Mhm.
because these people that are getting back out and reentering, they need to get back home. They need to get back home to take care of their kids, their spouses, their home. Like when the family is intact like
Mhm.
that, I think it's absolutely a driver in reducing recidivism, and making sure that there's it creates a shift in priorities. It makes you understand, this is the priority, not what I was doing. I have new priorities now, and that's what the most important. So I think that's huge.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And then kind of shifting back to Arkansas specifically, is that if they wanted to expand reentry programs statewide, like it sounds like you would
Mhm.
prefer, what would that look like? And what impact could it have on recidivism and public safety for your state in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think they absolutely could. I think it could be expanded all over the state. I think we could. There's a lot of private investors out there that I think would be interested in starting these facilities. There's old schools, there's old warehouses, there's old all sorts of stuff all across the state that you wouldn't have to you wouldn't have to start from the ground up, so to speak. You can just buy up these facilities, get them open, and start running them. And I think it would be huge. I think it could save a lot of money in the long run,
Yeah, 100%.
and it'd have
Well,
a great it'd have a great impact throughout the state. I think it just reducing cost more than anything.
yeah, no kidding. Lower cost, public safety, man.
Sure.
That's awesome. Well, Will, I love getting to talk to you about this stuff. You've seen so many different programs and you've gotten to write about them. So if anybody wanted to keep up with you, keep up with your work, learn more about these reentry programs specifically in your state or in their own, like give us some resources, let people know where they can find you and keep up.
Sure. You can follow me on X, Wil Cheatham, Wil Cheatham AR. I'm on LinkedIn. Email is wcheatham@rightoncrime.com. Look me up.
Awesome. And I'm really proud of you for calling it X and not Twitter.
Yes, I've been trying to make a conscious effort to not do that.
No kidding. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining, Will. We're excited to have you back on hopefully soon, and best of luck in your upcoming session. I'm sure we'll talk to you more about that as well. And thank you to the listener for joining us at the Right on Crime podcast. If you are interested in learning more about reentry, more about what Right on Crime does as a whole, please visit us at rightoncrime.com. And until then, we will see you next time.